In a world of constant change and innovation, trust is key, knowledge is power, and the inside track is everything. And now, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your host, Bruce Whitfield.
We're going to talk semigration on this particular episode, the move toward the Western Cape. There have been lots of pressures, push pressures in places like Gauteng, parts of the Eastern Cape, and of course, most recently, the double whammy of riots and then enormous floods in KZN, which anecdotally suggests that there is a big move towards the Western Cape. Western Cape governance, Western Cape politics, Western Cape employment. So many factors seem to be counting in its favor, while those with money make choices about their families' futures, and it's causing a bit of a sell-up in some of South Africa's more challenging environments. To help us look at this particular topic today is the FNB property economist, John Loos, who is with us once again, and also Rory O'Hagan, who is, and I must get this right, the chief executive of the Chas Everitt Luxury division. Let's start off with what luxury is, if you don't mind, Rory. Where do you find luxury?
So thank you, Bruce. Luxury is defined basically in terms of our strategic partners as properties of $1 million plus. So that's the broad definition of luxury. But in South Africa, what I'm saying is for 5 or 6 million rand, you can get what I would determine as being a luxury property. So luxury, in our opinion, is 5-6 million rand property up, and aspirational property, basically.
Okay, so anything 5 to 6 million rand up. In that environment, just how much movement is there in your view, Rory?
Well, it's interesting. We're seeing a lift in Gauteng, believe it or not, in terms of demand for luxury property. I was just earlier talking about properties we've launched in the Sandhurst area, where we've got as many as 5 offers on one property, and another super home that we launched, which is we've got 3 offers on. So the market's definitely, I keep calling it the waking giants in Gauteng, because we're coming off a very low base. So your value here is unbelievable. When you start to talk about the Western Cape, we're seeing a slightly different trend, which is where listings become massively sought after. So if you have a listing on the seaboard and it's correctly priced, it'll sell. So the trend is very much well-priced listings on the Atlantic seaboard. Parts of Constantia in the Western Cape are moving, but it's getting the listing that's the challenge. And so it's an interesting market at the moment.
And obviously, I mean, it's interesting that you talk about Sandhurst moving. I went through a little drive around Sandhurst, up Coronation and Empire Place and all of those roads. The number of boarded up building sites, for example, surprised me, where people seem to have stopped building or paused their building, and I don't know how long that has been the case for, and quite a few for sale signs. There does seem to be, a lot of stock on the market.
That's why I'm saying in Johannesburg there is a lot of stock, but we're starting to see it clear out, because I think, Bruce, what's happened is a lot of the sellers have become realistic with their pricing. So people are taking a knock. I mean, I've sold houses recently for the same price people bought them for 14 years ago. So I've got a couple of examples where the pricing is under pressure, but they've dropped to a level where the market actually is absorbing it. So the boarded up properties, it could be people that have moved down to the Western Cape and have said, look, I'll just board it up. I won't finish what I was going to do. I'm going to live in the Cape. But there's a definite move afoot of people taking up Joburg property. But I think sellers are becoming more realistic in Joburg. And I was actually talking to John earlier and saying one of the challenges in the Western Cape is parts of the Western Cape are pretty unaffordable for someone moving from Gauteng. I mean, you sell a 10 million rand home in Sandhurst, let's say, that's not going to buy you anything close to what you live here down in the Western Cape. So it's an interesting market, and it's got a lot of mixed messages in it at the moment.
We'll get onto those mixed messages in a second, but I mean, 10 million rand house in Sandhurst. I mean, is that the garden shed in Sandhurst, or has things fallen that far?
It's not. I mean, we've actually, I can up it to 20 million, you know, and I'm saying if you take a 20 million rand home in Sandhurst, you're not going to get the same kind of property in the Cape. But no, the Gupta's home is. That would probably be not far off that price, looking at the condition it's in at the moment.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I don't know who will get the money for it. Hopefully we will one day, but we'll see. John Loos, what does the data say? What does the data talk about semigration? Is it a bit of media hype, or is there really a big shift in South African demographics, particularly amongst wealthier people who may have some spare cash, who can afford to move and don't have to be constrained by the devaluation of their properties in some markets?
So, Bruce, I mean, I've followed the semigration trend for a decade or two. It's not media hype. It's been happening well before lockdowns for years, it's not that everybody's flocking to the Western Cape. Yeah. It's that a portion of the high end, the more affluent, sometimes even people bordering on billionaire, but the highly skilled segment of the labor market, that a more sizable portion of them moves Western Cape way relative to the size of the Western Cape market, should I say. And that often those people will get replaced. So it doesn't mean that Gauteng empties out. Gauteng's population is growing, and there's urbanization to Gauteng as well. But it may be a slightly lower income demographic moving in here compared to that's departing. And the Western Cape it's a combination of things. Because it's become known as a lifestyle province of the big economies, and as a well-run province, and many of its city councils are well-run and good infrastructure and so on, it's more popular amongst a portion of the highly skilled and the affluent retirees, as well as not letting as many people leave. It's retaining those people in the Western Cape better than what Gauteng or KZN is doing. So the net inflow of affluent into Western Cape for probably 2 decades or so has been noticeably stronger than Gauteng or any other province for that matter.
So how then let's take KZN and Gauteng, for example. KZN, we know the factors there. Gauteng, people are just frustrated with the city of Johannesburg, for example, failing infrastructure. It's shambolic, I think, is being polite on that particular front. It's leading to property devaluations. We're seeing Sandhurst, you can even buy a property for 10 million. You'll have to spend the same fixing it up, I'm sure. But the point being that these city councils have got a real problem on their hands. They're seeing real property devaluation. They're seeing rates therefore fall, and they're seeing semigration happening. They're seeing people leave. Good rate payers are leaving their areas, and that's devastating for the broader community in those areas, isn't it, John?
Well, there's a two-way causality here that I don't think many people think of. I think that the fundamental problem with, say, Johannesburg is that it was built on the greatest gold fields ever discovered in history. That was why it was here. It's a gold rush city. Yeah. The gold is virtually gone. What gold we have is way out in the Free State and elsewhere, and the gold is in decline. So people can say, well, it's the city council or something that's gone backwards, but I'm not sure that's just the case. I think that the management and the council and a lot of that deteriorates because Joburg's underlying reason for its existence in the first place has been dying, and so it's losing its competitive advantage. There's an economic impact on the amount of skills flocking to the region and those leaving, and that in turn influences the decline in quality of services and city management and so on. So I think one has to look at it the other way around as well. Joburg's competitive advantage has been dying for quite some time. It needs to find its new competitive advantage, whatever that's going to be. It's not as dramatic as a dying railway town like De Aar in the Karoo that when the railways closed down, its competitive advantage died overnight. It's not that dramatic, but it needs to find that new competitive advantage. Otherwise, for a lot of people, an increasing portion of people and businesses, there's no longer a reason to actually have to be here.
To that point, I mean, gold mining alone in the 1970s made up something like 35% of South African GDP. Clearly, that was unsustainable. Now, mining as a total makes up less than 8% of total GDP. We're a far more services economy. We're a far more financial services economy. And those companies are still headquartered very much maybe out of the Joburg CBD. Even the mighty Anglo-American has moved towards Rosebank. But we are seeing certainly the city of Johannesburg take a huge amount of strain, and that shift has continued north, of course, very, very significantly. You talked about the mixed signals just a moment ago, Rory O'Hagan. What are the mixed signals that you're seeing in the property market right now?
So it's interesting. What we've seen is, and to come back to the Sandhurst property, Bruce, that's in vacant, almost a vacant earth. So it's not a property you or I would want to live in. But
well, I don't know, Sandhurst, I'd pitch a tent. I think I'll be chucked out by the rate.
It's close to that.
But
it's very close to that. But to come back to the mixed signals, what we're finding is as the corporates reopen post-COVID, a lot of people who started this emigration have realized that actually they also need to be back in Johannesburg for whatsoever reason. So that's one of the mixed signals, is people that have moved or semigrated to the Western Cape who are part of a larger corporate are suddenly having to commute more to Johannesburg and finding that they're having to either buy a smaller place up in Joburg as a base or, but it is costly. So that's the one sort of messaging that's coming through. The other one is a lot of Joburg people in the high end, what we're seeing, are selling their homes, the more expensive homes if they can. They are taking a knock on the pricing, but they're buying down. So what I was saying to John earlier is that we're seeing the parks, as an example, in Joburg is doing incredibly well. Parktown North, those kind of areas where you can still live abundantly on a quarter of an acre, and you're not giving up that much, yet you can take your 10, 15 million differential between Hyde Park, Sandhurst and that area and either take it offshore or semigrate. So there's a massive trend in that. That's why I'm saying we're seeing mixed messages, but there are people buying up some of a lot of the sort of sub 10 million rand homes in selling their luxury homes.
I remember John Loos talking to an old economist about 10 years ago, so not you. But he was describing the 1970s to me in South Africa, the 1980s. And at the time of the Rubicon speech, of course, P.W. Botha with his waggy fingers, this caused absolute panic, and people were, in those days, going to bank branches and dropping the keys off for the bank manager saying, your problem, cheers, I'm gone, and disappearing off the face of the earth. We're not there, I don't think.
No, I don't think so. Look, the one thing that's been cushioning the blows economically, the economy has been in stagnation for about the last decade. I think it peaked. The growth rate peaked in 2011, I think it was, after the global financial crisis, a bit of a recovery, and then it sort of broadly stagnated all the way since then. So it's not a good sign, but what cushions the blow these days is ever more lenient interest rate cycles. Interest rates have been dropping since the 1990s in cycles. Each cycle's bottom gets lower and lower, and that's cushioned the blow across the world. Obviously, there's a catch to that. Every time interest rate cycles go lower, indebtedness of companies, of households, of government goes higher, and we've become a highly indebted nation now compared to what we were in the 1990s. So, interest rates can only go so far. I don't believe they can live at negative rates or something like that. So you're running out of runway. You've got a highly indebted country. You've got no more easy stimulus ammunition to throw at the problem. And then you've got to make this economy grow. Otherwise, the financial stress starts to mount. But at the moment, no, it's not a stressed situation. The COVID recession was deep, but it was cushioned by interest rate cuts, which were totally different to the global financial crisis, where there was a more moderate recession, but there were interest rate hikes of 5 percentage points leading up to that.
Yeah, we forget very, very quickly, of course, how the cycles actually did play out. I wonder if we look at it, Rory, and the cost of property transfers and the cost of property ownership, and whether or not you're seeing that as a restriction. What is it? R1 million transfer duties on a 10 million rand property, and it only goes up over that. I mean, there's a huge burden, of course, in this elite part of the residential property market.
Massive. And in fact, 100%, Bruce, we are finding that the top end of the market, it's a major factor, because the reality is the days of buying homes and seeing that growth over 2 or 3 years that would effectively absorb the cost of the transfer or the cost of the transaction are gone. So the reality is people are very, very, and that's driven prices down as well, because I'm an 8 million rand home. I'm paying what's about 700,000 rand transfer duty. So in order to just recoup the transfer duty, if I ever want to sell, I probably have to sell for 9.1, because I've also got estate agents com. So you've got all these factors that, and people in the high end are considering them. And I think transfer duty is a massive, massive factor at the higher end as well, in determining our sales price and, in fact, ultimately what people are offering. So.
And that shift, John Loos, I mean, I wonder how self-defeating those high costs are in terms of stimulating our economy, because they were introduced, 5 or 6 years ago, the higher rates on more expensive properties. And I wonder just how much of a constraint that is. Yes, it was introduced as a wealth tax and as a way of showing that the wealthy are being taxed for the benefit of the poor, and that was the politics of the decision. But I wonder in practical terms if it's not sort of outlived its usefulness in terms of the real revenue that it generates versus the lack of confidence it engenders, John?
Well, I think it's a mobility problem that it creates as well. You can't just buy and sell houses every time you move jobs and move around a city or move to another city. And in the modern world, a lot of people do move jobs or move locations quite frequently. So this is troublesome, to the extent that there was a study I'd read, and I won't be able to quote who it was, but in one of the states in the USA, or a number of states, but claiming that in one of the states of the USA where there was less home ownership and more rental, and the population were more mobile, that actually led to a lower unemployment rate. Now, I can't verify that, I can't prove it, but I do think that the transaction costs of property, the high transaction costs, are a serious constraint on labor mobility, and it's troublesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it certainly is. How does it play out? I mean, we're seeing the movement. We're seeing, therefore, lower property prices in places like KZN. We're seeing prices fall in large parts of Gauteng. We're seeing pockets of very strong growth in the Western Cape. Does the trend continue? It's been, as John says, been going on for the last decade or so, Rory, and maybe longer. Do you see the trend continue?
I think what look, the prices in Gauteng are, in my opinion, bottoming out in terms of the luxury property, because we've got properties that we've had on the market for a couple of years in the 20 millions. Owners are accepting in the late teens. So they've been tempered by the process, and over time, adding transfer duty to the prices, it's definitely tempered the demand for those top-end properties and for the prices we're getting. I think it's just, I keep talking about the waking giant, because we're getting a lot more demand for the higher-end homes than I've seen certainly in the last 4 or 5 years in Johannesburg.
That's massively, massively encouraging. It really is. And it's nice to know that there is that demand, albeit at a lower price than perhaps the sellers would like. The point is that there is economic activity. That economic activity is driving demand, and that demand is being realized in that property market. It's not all doom and gloom then, John Loos. I mean, it's slightly gloomy, but not the end of the world.
No, it's not all doom and gloom. I think people must be careful how they interpret news. If there's something like a semigration trend which is strong to the Western Cape, it doesn't mean that everybody is packing up and leaving and, last one to switch the lights off. That's sometimes how I think people interpret it. It's not the case. But I do believe, though, that Johannesburg has to find its new competitive advantage. There's a lot of signs of decay. There's a lot of signs that it's past its glory days. I don't know if World Cup finals are just automatically going to happen in Joburg in future, like was the case, and head offices don't all have to be here, like was the case at one stage. It's being chipped away by other competing centres, such as Durban, such as Cape Town, maybe lesser extent PE, the coastal metros. And it needs to find a competitive advantage and fight back. Otherwise, that gradual slide continues.
I was in the Eastern Cape recently in a small coastal town, one of those many little towns in between Gqeberha and Buffalo City. And you find yourself going through these little villages, and they're looking more prosperous than they did 5 years ago. And you make some inquiries, and it's about the building trade as people have relocated, the work from anywhere trend, where how long it persists, we'll see. But lots of self-employed people just going, I've got a fiber line now in the middle of the Eastern Cape. I can live here at the beach, and it's incredible, and it's quiet, and my kids can inherit a seaside bungalow at some point in the future. So it's not just the Western Cape. I mean, people are making lifestyle choices, Correct. John, and they're making, and I think that is the most powerful trend is, where do I want to be 10, 15 years from now? I'm actually going to go right now. I'm going to enjoy it.
100%.
Yeah, no, it's and technology is ever on the march and making all this decentralization that much more possible as time goes by.
One of the things I was talking to John about, Bruce, just is what we're finding, though, is a lot of people want to eyeball each other rather than solely be technology driven. So, we're finding there's a mix, and that's what I was talking about earlier with mixed messages, where a lot of the corporates are saying to employees, look, we need you back in the office for X number of days a month. And for that reason, and I also think something that we haven't really touched on is the war in Europe has made people rethink their personal strategy around where and how they want to live. Because, would you rather be worrying about a nuclear bomb or being, or a road with potholes? I don't know. So it's almost played to an extent to our benefit. And, of course, Europeans looking at the Western Cape for investment. But then that, again, drives the prices up. And it becomes quite tough for South Africans to afford areas like the Atlantic seaboard, driven by
I think
European
it's always
demand.
been the case, Rory. For most of us, it's always been the case. It's been a case for a while. Rory O'Hagan, thank you very much indeed. He is the head of the luxury property business within the Chas Everitt Group, and also to property economist at FNB, John Loos. Thank you very much for joining us this time.
Thanks, Bruce.